Hi everyone. In this video, I'll be going through cognitive, physical, and identity development in adolescence, and we'll start with cognitive development. So at this point, we're closing out the concrete operational stage, moving into the formal operation stage of development, according to Piaget. In this stage, adolescents are developing the ability to process abstract information, allowing them to think in the as-if mode. This means they don't have to directly experience something in order to be able to understand it. A basic example would be that you can imagine that there are other countries without ever having to have been there. At this stage, adolescents are also starting to be able to formulate and test hypotheses, such as considering how their actions might impact others before they actually do them. Remember, however, that adolescents are at the early stage of this process, so they still have a lot of learning to complete. Some limitations in this stage, they're still struggling with abstract concepts like forever, meaning that they can't really consider broader, larger scale effects and would continue to struggle with concepts like trust, justice, and so on. There are also some continued challenges, three main ones to be specific, that are unique to adolescents and related to their cognitive development. First is the imaginary audience, which is the belief that others are equally as interested in you as you are in yourself. So you're imagining that people are enthusiastically listening to or watching you as much as you are about yourself, which I guess is made much worse by social media. Personal fable is the next one, and this is the belief that your personal experiences and concerns are unique. They are so special and so unique that none of life's difficulties or problems will affect them regardless of their behavior. Because I am unique, I'm not subject to the consequences that others will experience. And one such fable is the invincibility fable, which is the belief of being invulnerable or even immortal. Okay, so here you could see the little chickies, and this is a depiction, I suppose, of the imaginary audience, so that everybody is looking at you. Okay. Here is a an image from Mean Girls about Katie. So she's in high school, is very concerned with wearing the right clothes, having the right phone, etc. So people will like her. She feels that if she doesn't wear the right things, everyone will notice her and laugh at her. So she is responding to the imaginary audience here. Okay. And then with the little superhero is getting at the invincibility. And so there are lots of possible implications. I'm sure that you've already kind of started to think about some of those. So believing that everybody is watching you when you make a mistake or don't do something the way you wanted to, that may impact your self-esteem because you feel like everybody has seen that, or feeling a lot of pressure to give in to what everyone else around you is doing, either behaviorally or with your dress or what you say or what you do, and how that can mess with ideas about the self and identity and all of that. Invincibility, obviously, engaging in more risk behaviors because you don't think that there are going to be any negative consequences, that the bad things are never going to happen to you. And this is why we see a lot of risk-taking behaviors in adolescence. And we could go on and on and on. And so those are things to keep in mind with cognitive development. Shifting into physical development in adolescence, there has been a substantial downward shift in the age of puberty. Whereas it used to be starting around age 15, it's dropped to age 13 and younger. And although there are some racial or ethnic differences, this trend does tend to hold pretty strongly across the board. Now, why is this happening? There's a lot of contributors to this shift. One is there are higher rates of obesity in adolescence, and obesity does trigger puberty. Adolescents tend to also experience significant sources of stress with transitions into different school settings, peer pressure, more challenging coursework, more responsibility, etc. And this may also trigger puberty. The experience of early childhood abuse may also be contributing, to these shifts. And then finally, societal pressures that adolescents are internalizing that continue to contribute to stress, and again, will contribute to puberty starting sooner. So knowing what we know about ecological systems and brain development, you might ask yourself, what does this shift mean for adolescents? Definitely going to mean dealing with additional stressors much earlier. There are stressors that come with puberty, as you all know. The hormonal shifts may contribute to emotional stressors and difficulty managing mood, and then pressures with not fitting in. And there are, of course, some gender differences there, and what early puberty means for males versus females. What does this mean for therapy with adolescents? Again, hormones, and that's going to impact perhaps what you're discussing in therapy, what the client wants to do in therapy, how invested they are in therapy, and so on. You're also going to have to be addressing issues of sexuality and body image at a much earlier stage and age than previously. Right? And I have some information about sexuality in a later lecture. And then finally, what does society say about early maturity? Is there shame? Is there stigma? Do we equate bodily maturity to cognitive maturity? And what are the problems associated with that? Another thing to keep in mind here is the adolescent brain and stress. We've talked about in the past how stress during the prenatal period is difficult and poses a lot of challenges. And we've also discussed it a little bit in terms of early childhood and early development. And so now we'll discuss stress in adolescence really briefly. Knowing that stress may trigger puberty and that puberty brings stress with it, this is an important thing to discuss. So adolescent brains are very sensitive to stressors. Remember that the brain has not fully developed at this point, and biologically recall that changes in hormone levels can affect the development of important neurobiological circuits in the brain. So adolescents in this stage are more sensitive to social and emotional feedback. They also have a much stronger physiological response to events and an exaggerated startle response for the most part. And they're going to have increased negative mood and volatility, rating themselves as higher in negative affect. There's also the potential for development to go poorly or well, depending on the response that the adolescent receives and the support that they receive. So take, for example, changes in the brain might make an adolescent take more risks, okay? And we talked about how invincibility goes into this. Now, if the adolescent is receiving support from adults or mentors to teach them about learning opportunities and building responsibility and taking structured risks, then the adolescent is more likely to have improved self-confidence and better gauge the potential consequences of those risks. And so in that case, hopefully, ideally, the adolescent is going to take less risks, or if they do engage in risk-taking behavior, are going to be able to access the supports and resources that they need so that those risks don't have huge detrimental consequences. Alternatively, if we look at a more negative spiral, biological changes are often going to want to make adolescents stay up later, for example. Now, in the absence of structure and appropriate mentoring by parents, this might go unchecked and is subsequently supported by seeing or hearing about peers doing the same. This can, of course, lead to an erratic sleep schedule, which we know impedes learning and affects mood negatively. So this could be problematic. Whereas the alternative, having a structured home environment and an open line of communication with parents, might help to prevent the development of an erratic sleep schedule, which is going to then have positive effects on learning and mood and everything else. Okay, I've talked about some of this already. Here's a graphic of those possible positive and negative spirals during adolescent development. So you can pause here and take a look at how things are tracking and see how the examples that I've shared with you might play out in each of these. Okay. So to sum things up, just as the first 5 years of a child's life are really rapid periods of development when things can go very right or very wrong, the period of adolescence is another window of opportunity. Again, things can go very right and set the adolescent up for becoming a healthy, productive, contributing member of society, or they can go very wrong and exacerbate vulnerability at a very important transitional period. Now we'll switch gears slightly to discuss narrative therapy, which is an approach that can be helpful with helping adolescents process and manage stress during this period. First, we'll talk about telling one's story. So this involves reauthoring one story in order to find alterations to it or to make a new one. And this allows the individual to make meaning and find purpose in their experiences. Okay? Another technique that could be helpful is externalizing, and this involves leading the client toward viewing problems as external instead of as part of the self. So internalizing the belief that you are not the problem is the problem. Using language that helps personify the problem is helpful in doing this externalizing process. For example, in response to the statement, "I am useless," you might say, "The problem tries to tell you about the type of person you are? How does it try to convince you that you're useless? And when does this useless feeling visit? So language like that and a discussion in that way that helps to allow the client to externalize their problem rather than internalizing it can be really helpful. The internalization, of course, naturally, if you believe I am useless, is going to contribute to issues with self-esteem and self-efficacy. Whereas if you externalize the problem, you might be more readily open to accepting help or to seeking out help for dealing with that problem, because it is not you, it is the problem. Another technique is the deconstruction technique, which involves breaking a problem down in order to make it easier to understand and address and to reduce generalization. So, for example, when an adolescent is dealing with a social problem, for example, which can seem like this huge, all-encompassing issue, you can break it down into specific segments and then tackle each of the specific segments in an easier, more manageable way. And then finally, the unique outcome techniques involves choosing to focus on a different storyline than the one that has been the source of your problem. So it's almost like in a book where you're changing the viewpoint from one character to another, helping you to see that you are not only your problem and your life is not dominated by your problem. Okay, the last section that we'll be talking about is adolescent identity development. Okay, so during this period, adolescents are in the identity crisis stage, trying to determine who they are. Okay, so according to Erikson, the identity crisis stage, trying to figure out who they are, what their role is, how to manage their many competing roles, perhaps. Okay. And we have a couple of different statuses according to Erikson. So first we have diffusion, which involves not actively exploring any possible life choices. So in essence, avoiding that issue. We also have moratorium, which involves exploring but not committing. In college, you can kind of think about this, although that's later than what we normally consider adolescence, although it's technically still kind of adolescence. If you think about college and someone who's like switching majors all of the time, so they're exploring lots of different majors, but they can't commit to one. Foreclosure is the opposite, so committing to something without exploring alternatives. We might see this culturally with adolescents who are pressured into a certain career path by their families or by their culture, and they're unable to explore any alternatives out of fear of being ostracized by their family, very real fear of being ostracized. And then finally, achievement, which is what we want, is the ability to explore and then commit based on your exploration and your experience of all of the different options. Expanding this a little bit, it's important to remember that these don't tend to happen linearly. They can also be domain specific. So you might commit to something in one part of your life, like you may be committed at a very early age that you're going to have 12 kids. It's a lot of kids. But maybe not in other areas. So you haven't maybe committed to a particular career, right? But you know that you're going to have those 12 kids. Good luck. All right. Now, why does identity matter? Obviously, it's going to help to develop a sense of self, who you are, what your personality is. And that's necessary for developing goals, for pursuing a career, for having good self-esteem. And the alternative is the diffusion part is going to be associated with low self-reflection, low self-esteem, high neuroticism, and avoidant coping. And even if we look back at some of these others here, like moratorium, you can see how this might be associated with a lot of life dissatisfaction. If you're committing to a career and it turns out that you just really don't like it, right? So, yeah. What are some things to look for with identity development? If the adolescent is acting in uncharacteristic ways, they're lying, they're engaging in adult behaviors, they're moody, they're sarcastic, they're rebellious, they're overly fixated on preoccupation with fitting in, they're trying on different identities, and they're excluding those who are not like them. So whereas some of these things are signs of identity exploration, like trying on different identities, some of the others may be indicative of a problem brewing, right? So the preoccupation with fitting in, if it comes to the point that it's really affecting the adolescent's functioning, then this is problematic, right? The idea of excluding those who are not like them, although that kind of can be mean, is understandable as the adolescent is trying to figure out who they are, right? And a certain degree of the lying and the sarcasm and the rebellion, a certain degree of that is normal as they try on these different identities and they explore and engage in risk behaviors as part of developing who they are. Okay, so how can we help to foster identity development and exploration? What can we do? We can definitely help to encourage the client to engage in self-exploration and self-reflection. We can use goals in therapy that encourage this, right? So maybe if we stick to the career example, a goal in therapy might be for the client to explore different careers and likes and dislikes about them, right? We can also have a goal about emotional coping in order to help them to deal when they're feeling overwhelming feelings or when they're experiencing peer rejection or when they're having conflict with their parents, right? These are two activities that, or well, this is one right now, activities that I like that can be helpful for identity exploration. So this one here is the You Soup recipe. And so the client basically gets to explore the different components or the different pieces or parts of themselves and the things that matter to them. So they have their base and broth that are their demographics, essentially early additions like growing up, their early environment, optional things, the things they like, their faith, their career, beliefs, all of that, their values, and then other additional secret ingredients. And then in creating this, and they can physically create this and list out their ingredients, this can elicit a really useful and interesting exploration of the person's identity, the adolescent's identity. Okay, you could also do an identity brainstorm, and here are some questions for the identity brainstorm that you could just engage in this discussion with your client, right? I would encourage you to engage in this discussion with yourself, okay? Finally, you can also use art therapy techniques to help the client through identity exploration and development. A gender role collage is an example. So creating a collage about what they believe are their roles based on their gender, and maybe on the other side of that, what they would like their roles to be. Okay. You could do a sociogram, which involves creating symbols for the self and others and discussing how they perceive themselves in relation to others in their family or others in their peer group. You could do an inside-outside box. So on the inside, having them depict either by drawing or with images or with words, how they feel inside, and then also how they present themselves to others and discussing the differences between the two and whether any dissonance is elicited through that. You could do the essence of self activity, which is a really simple, broad activity where the client is prompted to use any art materials they like in order to illustrate or depict themselves. A character strengths collage is similar to any other kind of collage that you do, except the focus is on their strengths. So a strengths-based approach to depicting themselves, right, which can be really helpful for self-esteem. And then you could also do a dreams and aspirations collage or a dream board to help the client to remain future oriented, to develop goals for themselves, and maybe even to engage in a discussion of how they might reach those goals. Okay. So that is it for this one, a really brief overview of a lot of different things that are gone into much more depth in your textbook, but hopefully some strategies for how you might explore some of these issues with self and identity and cognition in therapy with your clients. All right, so we'll discuss more in class. Let me know if you have questions or if you have other strategies or activities that you've engaged in or that you've heard of that could be helpful during this period. I'd really love to hear them. All right, thanks for listening, everyone.